Hello, everyone. Welcome to the semester. Welcome to week one, chapter one of the fall term 2021. I'm Professor Rios, and I wanted to give you, well, this is what the normal lessons will be like. It will be a combination of the PowerPoint presentation that you can download on Moodle Rooms and a tour of the region, whatever that region happens to be, using Google Earth. Obviously, we're not going over a region during week one, but I will at least like to go over Google Earth so that you have at least a better idea of how to use it. It will get used during the semester, so I highly encourage you to take advantage of that very important free resource that's available to you. So we're going to put this away for a second, sort of minimize it, and I'm going to maximize this. So let's go get right into it. Please bear in mind that this presentation is available in a PDF that you can download. I don't recommend printing it. You can either download it or you can view it online, whatever works for you. In addition, this is not administrative in nature. This is more content driven. There's a little bit of admin, but not too much. So take advantage of that as well. So each week, there's going to be, so the first 2 weeks, chapters one and two, are not really region specific. They are covering whether it be concepts of geography, which is chapter one, or physical geography and the environment, which is chapter two. After that, every single week will be viewed from the context or under the guise of what the materials in lessons one, chapter one, and week two, chapter two covered. So everything will be viewed through that prism. Okay. So having said that, let's get going. Um, let's see here. We have your textbook. So it will be chapter one, concepts of geography. It is Roundtree 7th edition. It is called Diversity Amid Globalization, World Regions, Environment, and Development. All homework and quizzes will be managed through Mastering Geography, through you have to set up an account. The book is not really a book, it's something more along the lines of an e-text that you will access through Mastering Geography. Okay? So these are the learning objectives for today. They are establishing understanding the world and the diversity that the world has to offer as a function of globalization and interconnectedness, and to develop an understanding for the ways in which geography helps us analyze really everything about the world we live in. Okay? These are some of the key concepts for the lesson and for the week. So, first of all, what is geography? Geography is an interesting science. It's a social science, but it can be a natural science as well. It's really the idea of studying connectedness, occurrences, distributions of physical and sort of social slash human factors and how and why you see them, where you see them. The idea of people and the environment having some sort of bridge, and that bridge being uh, the landscape. Okay. Geography, and think about the idea of places mattering. This is something that my boss, long time ago, made it, sort of inculcated into me and into anyone that worked for him. And the idea that you have you make decisions based on location all the time, whether it be where you go to live, where you go to school, where you buy a house, where you go on vacation. Really, it's all locationally driven. In the case of this particular image, where and why was this wind field established here? There are probably both financial and also locational reasons, environmental reasons for it. This is how your book is broken down by your textbook. Again, you could argue that some of these boundaries are might be a little bit arbitrary, and that's okay. Um, because frankly, dividing space doesn't have perfect boundaries. But having said that, this is a pretty good breakdown of the world in terms of the regions. In week three, we begin with North America and we sort of wind our way through the world and end up with Australia and Oceania towards the end. So, globalization, diversity amid that globalization, the idea of the interconnectedness and the increasing interconnectedness between places. Think about the idea of where, when you make a phone call to a call center or to a technical uh, assistant, whether it be your phone company, your computer company, oftentimes you reach places that are not really in the United States. Sometimes that works really well, sometimes it doesn't work well at all. So this isn't really an indictment on that. It's just simply letting you know that there is this sort of offshoring that is taking place over time. Companies basically divest some of those functions to subcontractors, as it were, to take care of that. The idea of global culture, it is one of the things that the United States promotes probably the most in the Western world is sort of like American culture, American businesses. Think about the idea of a McDonald's, and I'm not really putting that in the good side, but you can find McDonald's pretty much anywhere in the world, just about. Okay. Diversity and globalization. Think of where your stuff comes from. So whether it be your laptop or your phone or your hoodie or your pair of Nikes or your Apple Watch or your whatever, chances are it came from somewhere else, and it probably came in one of these shipping containers, and then it was carried from that location to warehouses, and then it was basically distributed by, I don't know, Amazon Prime or UPS or FedEx or whatever the case might be. So it's the idea of, some of this is good because you can be at home on your couch and decide that you want to order a frame, and you can just go on Amazon Prime and look for it, and it will be shipped to you for free, and it'll be at your house in a day or two. So that's globalization right there. Are you willing to do away with that? Are you willing to not have that available to you? If you're not, then you're basically a pro globalization type, just letting you know. Uh, and I don't think we're getting rid of this really anytime soon. I mean, this is sort of the world we've become accustomed. And frankly, this precedes COVID. It became more of a big deal during the pandemic because, well, things have to be delivered that way. But it was happening before. It will certainly happen after when it's all said and done. So these are the advocates: logical, inevitable convergence of economic systems. There are critics of it. It makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. And then the middle position, which frankly is where most people frankly lie. Globalization and COVID, while this topic is by now, I'm sure you're tired of hearing the word COVID. It is super significant and really tied to globalization. And COVID made some things more sharply defined, it made other things less so. But in the middle of all that was globalization. So again, it's something for you to think about. It is frankly, I believe it is the topic of the first week discussion on the class on Moodle Rooms. So take advantage of that. I think it's something that you can clearly get into and discuss with a big amount of confidence because you've been a part of it, whether you want it to be or not. The idea of formal and informal globalization. So, whether you're a member of a trade organization or not, is formal because it's defined to a country's boundary. Informal, it could be the flow of cocaine or drug or pot or other illicitly grown drugs out there. They're not necessarily grown in one area only. They're grown in various regions, and then it goes from that area where they are grown into the area where there's a demand, like the United States, like Europe, like parts of Africa and Central America. So that's the idea of it being informal. It's informal because it isn't defined by a very specific set of boundaries, like a country or a county or even a province, for example, in Canada. Regions can be formal, like this would be a formal region. Regions can be informal, like what I showed you with the drug trade. Uh, Regions can be vernacular, and that's basically the idea of you've heard of Silicon Valley. Well, Silicon Valley is an area, but is it exact? Look at that green arrow or line that defines Silicon Valley. Notice how it's sort of idealized. It doesn't really attach itself to a specific county. In this case, one, two, three, four, five, six different counties um, are part of what's called Silicon Valley. But that's one individual's idea. It could frankly change or be different depending on who draws the map. Here's an area, for example, this is the growth of food. This is the California Mexico border. So this would be California here. This would be Mexico. This is the Imperial Valley. And this is the equivalent region in Mexico. So think about it for a minute. You live in New York and you love blueberries or you love raspberries or you love oranges, almond for your almond milk. None of that comes from New York in winter. None of it. The climate doesn't support it. So where does it come from? Well, it can come from Mexico, Costa Rica, Central America, California, Arizona, Florida. They have the climates that can support that. So that's the idea of sort of the connectedness of space and place. The human environment interaction. So in 2010, there was one very significant eruption in Iceland, currently undergoing eruption right now, um, that disrupted travel in and out of Europe. And that had a significant impact on the global economy in that year and the year that followed. And this is a place in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that was frankly severely disrupting the world economy because it is in the middle of the airline traffic pattern between the United States and Canada and Europe. So that had a significant impact, not unlike the impact that COVID had on not only the airline industry, but the economy as well. We'll talk about differentiation and integration. One of the best examples I think I like to use is Facebook. As of the beginning of the year, think about that 37% of all humans and 72% of all Americans had an account on it. It doesn't mean that every one of those individuals necessarily used it all the time, but they had an account that was active. And that is a lot of people. The landscape, the cultural landscape. This is the idea of the visible imprint that people leave behind. Think about it as the scar of people. In other words, when you see it, you realize that wasn't done naturally. Humans did that. So in this case, it happens to be a rice paddy field in the Philippines. The Philippines can be very hilly and mountainous, and you need flat areas in order to grow rice. So if you're going to grow rice, you have to change the landscape artificially and create these terraces so that you can then grow rice in each individual one of these. That is part of the cultural landscape. Another one would be the city of Dubai. which you can see has changed unbelievably so from the 1990s till now. And that's the idea of reinvention of space as a function of them realizing they don't have really any oil, or they have oil that is running out and they realize this. So they've reinvented their entire economy into a more service oriented and entertainment oriented one. They currently hold the world record for tallest building on Earth, the Burj Khalifa. And this building is 1,000 feet taller than the World Trade Center in New York. So that gives you a sense of how tall. If you can picture the World Trade Center in New York, imagine putting another 1,000 feet on top of that. Cultural landscape, one of the more significant aspects of it would be religion. And religion, even if you're not a particular adherent of a religion, you maybe take part in a lot of the rituals, the holidays, the meals that go along with it. It becomes part of celebration in many, many parts of the world, depending, it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, Hindu, whatever your religion happens to be. Uh, so that gives you a sense of how significant and how prominent these buildings are in the world. That they, think about a place like Rome or the Vatican. Think about Mecca in Saudi Arabia or other such places where religion is a very, very dominant aspect of that. Population is a big deal, and it's probably one of the things that beginning lesson three or week three will be discussed as part of every aspect of the semester. So, how population is affected in each of the different regions. So, we'll look at things like obviously statistics and population and how that changes depending on where you are. We'll talk about things like overall population fertility rate, which is the total number of children born to a woman during her reproductive years. We'll talk about percentage urban and so on. So all these data will become available and we'll discuss them throughout. These are some of the age and population structures. They're pretty simple um, diagrams. They talk about the idea of the male and female sides of the population by individual 5 year groups. And in some cases, you can see where there's rapid growth, slow growth, or even negative growth. We'll talk about the demographic transition model, which is something that was developed to explain how Europe's population evolved over time, but it can be used for other places with a little bit of caution. So you're looking at birth rate and death rate compared to one another, and if there's a big difference, the population grows. If the difference begins to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, the population grows, but it slows. In some cases, you reach a stage of break even. And this is roughly where the United States is right now, where there's a low birth rate, but also a lower death rate. And stage five, which is the sort of opposite of stage two, where your population is actually shrinking over time because the death rate exceeds the birth rate. And oftentimes, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that your population is getting older. And that's what's happening right now in the United States. We are getting older as a country. Migration is a significant human component of population. Sometimes it's voluntary, other times it is not. So, one example would be slavery. So, most African slaves came through Western Africa into mostly South America, but some Central and North America. But the majority of African slaves basically went into Brazil, what's present day Brazil. Um, Another movement of people that was forced, it is the so called Trail of Tears. in the United States, and that is the forcible removal rather of Native Americans out of places like Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina into what we call present day Oklahoma. The idea of the Trail of Tears, meaning they were forcibly taken away from their homeland. We'll talk about the idea of settlement and geography of urban spaces, whether it be like rural or whether it be something more along the lines of urbanity. And in that case, it depends where you are. You can look at a place like Rio or Sao Paulo in Brazil and realize that those cities have very specific makeups. They have these places called favelas, which are basically unimproved, organically grown places immediately next to what we would call the normal sort of prototypical city with tall buildings. This is called urban primacy. And urban primacy is the idea that every large city in the developing world tends to have every large country, or every country in the developing world tends to have a primate city, meaning a dominant city that is bigger than anything else in its borders by usually a factor of two. We'll talk about diversity and hybridization, the idea of cricket, something that's very popular in India and Pakistan and also in the United Kingdom. It's sort of like baseball in the United States and Latin America and Japan. It's been basically exported. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about language, a significant aspect of culture. We will talk about religion and how religion spread and why you find religions where you do and the changes from whether it be Christianity on the Protestant side to Christianity on the Catholic side, Islam, um, Hinduism, Buddhism, all those kinds of religions. So it really depends where you are, and it gives you an interesting geographical pattern. We'll talk about the geopolitical framework, the colonial imprint, something you cannot get away from if you're going to understand regions of the world. We are the result of colonialism in the United States. The British, the Spanish, the French have at some point controlled the United States, or what we call the United States. And you see that in the names of cities like Los Angeles and Sacramento and Santa Fe, whereas in places that were originally settled by the French, you find a lot of French names and so on. Africa. You can't get away from looking at Africa and studying it through the prism of Belgium, French, German, British, Portuguese, colonial imprint. It's there. And so it hasn't gone away. It likely won't go away. It's a part of their current makeup. Um, and you find that throughout South America, Central America, North America, Australia, and other such places. Again, whether it be refugee flows, this happens to be what happened in Syria as a result of ISIS. That has significantly cooled down over the last few years, which is a good thing. But it's good to understand why people left Syria in droves and ended up in places like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Europe. Some of the economic factors that we'll address, things like the Human Development Index, um, youth literacy, gender inequality. And so a lot of these indices pretty much tell you which country is considered developed and which country is not considered developed. All right, you can take a map that is very broad. You can take a region like Madagascar and then look at it in more detail. Okay, You can look at, for example, this is a human development index for Madagascar is considered low. Well, then you can look at Madagascar itself and look at the percentage of the population living below the poverty line. And notice how a lot of the color is pretty high percentage. Women and literacy and women's role in society. A lot of these places, for example, look at this map right here. It's a dated map, pretty old already. It's over 10 years old, but it's still pretty applicable. It shows you the darker the green, the greater the difference between the educational level of male versus females in that population. And notice where there's a very small difference: US, Canada, most of Europe, Australia. So it's telling you something. The idea of women and education honestly tells you a lot about the development level of a country. It just it's just the way it is. It works out really, really well. So that's the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this and open this. And I'm going to make it large scale. And so Google Earth is something that is run using Google Chrome. It will not run on any other browser. So if you don't have it, download it. Doesn't cost you anything. It's pretty easy to do. And chances are most of you already have it on your Mac or your Windows machine or your, um, oh, what is it, the Chromebook. Obviously, if you have a Chromebook, clearly you have Chrome. Um, so Google Earth is a way of looking at the Earth as it is meant to be seen. So looking at it as a sphere. You can see a lot of physical geography features, like, for example, or human features. So here's a landscape. Here's the state of Rondonia in Brazil. And this is sort of the poster child for um, deforestation. So if you zoom in, you see that the tropical rainforest should look like this: deep, dark green. This is untouched land. Humans have had no impact here whatsoever. Now, if you go further north and east and you start looking at this area, you can see how it changes and how you go from this tropical jungle setting to farm fields, basically. And the color goes from dark green to light green and sometimes brown. And so this is humanity changing the landscape in a very, very, very obvious way that can be seen from space, quite frankly. Okay? And there are consequences to this. If you go away from Brazil and you go into Peru and Bolivia, you see the tropical jungles here, and you can see how dramatic the change is. So this is tropical jungle and suddenly desert. And so once you get here, now look at the color of the land. And what you see here is the Atacama Desert. So you go from one of the wettest regions in the world to one of the driest. Okay. In addition, Google Earth allows you to see things like the interaction between this plate, tectonic plate, and, for example, this plate. And where that connection is taking place, you get a oceanic trench. So you get a very deep ocean next to an immediately very tall mountain chain, like the Andes. So this allows you to see this pretty well. If you sort of look away on a much larger scale, you can see, for example, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there's this giant crack along the entire length of the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, if you zoom in, you can see it and you can follow it. And when you follow it, sometimes it will poke its way through the surface and create land, like Iceland. Iceland is volcanic. If you've been listening to the news for the better part of the last 3 months, you know that there's a volcano that's been erupting there. And notice where it's been erupting. Here's the line. Here's the Mid Atlantic Ridge right there. Here's the capital of Reykjavik. And the volcano is this black splotch you see there. That's it. So that's where the volcano is active, basically creating new land. Iceland is actively splitting up. One half is going this way, the other half is going that way. So that's a reason why this is a volcanically active and tectonically active region. So you can see a lot. You can see a lot using Google Earth. There will be some exercises based on it. You can see things like, for example, let's look at Turkey. So you look at Turkey, there it is. Turkey is odd in its geographical setting. Part of it is in the Middle East, attached to Syria, Iraq, Iran. The other part is attached to Europe, Bulgaria, Greece. So is Turkey European or Middle Eastern? Or is it both? Or does it depend where you are? It's not an easy question to answer because the further east you go, the more Muslim and Middle Eastern it looks, the more Western, perhaps Christian it looks, the further west you go. So Turkey is an interesting sort of boundary between two worlds, two regions, as it were. Google Earth allows you to see what's going on in Egypt. So Egypt's capital is Cairo, an old city of 22 plus million people, very congested and very poorly planned because it grew sort of organically. It sits at the beginning of the Nile Delta, which is a very flat and fertile region where the majority of people live. But if you look closer, look what they are building in Egypt. They're literally building themselves a brand new city called New Cairo. And New Cairo, if you zoom in, notice how, if you look at Old Cairo, see how hodgepodge and it's sort of super dense and there's really no rhyme or reason to it, right? But if you look at New Cairo, you can see how there are wide roads with circles and everything is sort of structured. There are plans to build the world's tallest building here. Whether that happens or not, that's still to be determined. But this is what Egypt is attempting to do. They're attempting to basically take away 6 million people from here and have them move to the new city. And that's going to take a while. It's not going to happen overnight, obviously. But, that's the idea of reshaping and reclaiming your own environment uh, to suit your needs. There are other places, like, for example, oh, here you go. So I'm going to look at Canberra in Australia. The capital of Australia. This is also an invented city. Notice how beautifully organized with lots of circles. This is where all the administration of Australia happens. This is where their parliament is. All their government functions are here. They're not in Sydney. They're not in Melbourne. They're not in Perth. They're in this invented city. Another one would be Washington, D.C., our very own capital. So when you look at Washington, D.C., you see the executive branch, basically where the president lives. That's the executive. You have the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court, and you have the legislative, which is the United States Capitol. And if you look along the mall where you find the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument and all that, you find all kinds of buildings and um, national museums and libraries and the Supreme Court and all kinds of, the FBI and all the things that the president has in his cabinet. They're all here. And that's because this is where the country is sort of administratively managed from. So Washington is an invented city, so to speak. It's been made to look a very specific way in order to serve a need and a function. There are other places like Islamabad in Pakistan, Abuja in Nigeria, and also Brasilia in Brazil. So you can go. Hopefully, I'm spelling it correctly. Nope, Brasilia. Of course, I can't spell. So let's see. As you can see, my spelling is not the best. So let's find it. I know roughly where it is. So it's so you look at, let's see. You look at Brazil. Brazil has a very large there it is, Brasilia. Couldn't quite follow it. So there's the capital of Brazil right there. But the two biggest cities are Rio and Sao Paulo. Right there, Rio and Sao Paulo. So the majority of people were concentrated to these two locations. So Brazil decided to basically invent a new place towards the Amazon, and they called it Brasilia. And that's how you spell it. There you go. And if you go in, you can sort of see it is more organized and it's sort of less organic in its look. Um, it's very populated right now, and so it's this is it. This is the capital of Brazil. But if you look at it from the perspective of where it is, look at it. It's kind of in the middle of not a lot. So, I mean, Brazil itself is still enormous. It goes all the way out here. So, Brazil has the Amazon. It's home to the Amazon River. And even Brasilia, which was initially established to get away from these two, is still really, really far from, say, a city like Manaus, which is deep, and I mean deep in the jungle that is the Amazon. Okay. So, and by the way, something that Google Earth allows you to see very well is this is called Rio Negro, Black River, and this is the Amazon. Look at the color difference. That's real water. The water is really dark, and that's a function of some of the materials that leach into it. So here you can see how the water of the Amazon blends in with the water of the Rio Negro. And it creates a very unique sort of look to that. And you can see that really, really well in this using Google Earth. So Google Earth is not perfect. It's not now. It's not real time, obviously, but it is a very, very useful tool that I hope you take advantage of throughout the semester. So, having said all that, I hope you have a fantastic semester. I look forward to interacting with you and have yourself a great first week. Bye.